Alright, so we've set our frame attribute here, but we haven't actually used this yet in our set instance wrangle. Currently it's still set to attribute frame, and so this is going to load our current frame number. So let's just change this to use I attribute fr, and now we're using the frame sort of settings we're using here to drive our instance file. Okay, let's just come up and come to our render cam to have a quick look through our render view. I'm going to open up Redshift render view here. Just set this to be fit window for now. Just click render, see what we have. So at the start we've got nothing growing on here, and at the end wait for it to load. Now it is taking a little bit longer to render this time because we are offsetting our cache number. Redshift has to load way more proxies than before on each frame. When it was just based on the current frame, it would only really have to load 5 proxies, one for each of our plant geometries. But with it randomized, we could be loading hundreds now for all the different stages of animation. It's not bad considering the amount of geometry we are using and doing, and I think it's still probably the quickest way to do this, but it can take a little bit of time perhaps. We're going through this now. You can see now, if we go through, you can see it's now starting to grow on nicely along this. Okay, so let's come back to our camera for a second. We're in render cam here. I'm going to set our frame range back to 125. Remember, we actually increased this to 150 to animate our plants, but we are setting our render range to just be 125. The extra 1 second was to give us some space in our animation so we can offset things a little bit. So at the moment our camera is just static, and I want to add a little bit of animation to this so it's a bit more interesting in terms of a move. I just want it to kind of move along our branch, maybe rotate around. It's going to be subtle, but it's going to add a little bit of something extra just as this all sort of blooms on. So I'm going to come to our render camera, and I'm actually going to put down a null first. Just leave it at the origin, and if I parent this to our render cam, I can then use this to sort of animate our camera around this point. So let's just call this anim. I'm going to come to my render camera, and I'm just going to come to transform. I'm going to do keep position when parenting and turn that on, so then when I connect this, it's going to keep its position. So now we can use this one, and if I were to say just translate along Z, get a little bit of movement like that, and we could rotate perhaps around Z just to kind of give it a bit of twist as it moves. So I think I'm going to maybe move about, let's have a look, might start a little bit further back, say about 0.05 perhaps, and then I'm going to finish at our initial position, which was about 0, just so you can move a little bit like that. And maybe for our rotation, perhaps I will, let's see, maybe just try going between 5 degrees, maybe -1, just to give it a little bit of a twist. Now we could keyframe these like we have done in the past just by Alt and clicking, but I'm also going to show you the fit function. I actually want our animation to be completely linear along here. I don't want any easing in or easing out, and fit's actually going to be just like a mix, and it's going to let us just remap something to something else. It's a bit like attribute remap. So if we put fit, you can see it takes a value, which is our num. It's going to remap from an old min, an old max, to a new min and a new max. So I'm putting this in our translate Z. I'm going to say the attribute to remap is going to be frame, which is our current frame number. The old min and max is going to be 1 to 125. So we're just essentially taking the first frame to the last frame. And let's remap that to be, what did I say, 0.05, I think, to 0. So with that done, we've essentially created an attribute that will now run from 0.05 to 0 along the length of our animation like that. And if you middle mouse click, you can see that happening just like this. So it's a nice alternative to having to use keyframes. If you want to adjust it, you can quite easily just come in here and just change your numbers between the two values. So let's do the same thing now for our rotate Z. So I'm going to put fit once again. I'm going to open brackets. Let's put attribute frame, capital F. Let's go 1 to 125. And I'm going to go from, I think it was 5 degrees to -1. Let's have a look at this. You can see now we've got a little bit of movement here. It's very, very subtle, but it's just a little bit of something that's going to help our camera from feeling completely static. Okay, cool. So if we were to now come back to our main setup, this is what we currently have. Let's have a look at our actual Redshift render view, and we can see on our first frame we have no plants growing onto our branch here. You can also see we've actually got our light showing up in the render now as well. So I'm going to come to our top and bottom camera here. I'm going to come to our light. I'm just going to disable the visibility so it's not visible in our render. Also, this is feeling a little bit blown out here, so I might come to our photographic exposure and just bring down the allowed overexposure. Just take it down to about 0.2, I think. And that feels a little bit better there. Okay, so I kind of want to have a little bit of our plants grown on at the start on the very first frame, so it's not completely bare. Let's go and adjust our frame number inside our range like this. So if we come to our setup, you can see at the moment, this is kind of the display of where our frame number is. Remember, this is not going to scale things up. This is just kind of like a visualizer for our frame number as a sort of portion of our overall animation. So at the moment, here everything's sort of scaled down to 0. This is frame 1. So let's come to our set frame range attribute. I'm just going to offset everything a little bit. So I'm going to bring this up. I think I'm going to go to about 25. You remember we actually animated 150 frames and we're rendering 1 to 125. So we're actually, with the 25 offset, we're kind of pushing it to our limit now. So you do need to be a little bit aware of that. If we were pushing it higher, we're going to have problems because we're going to run out of cache files. But I didn't want to make too many extra frames of Redshift proxies here, just to keep the file size down for this course. So I'm going to put this to 25, which is kind of our maximum. But you can see here now we've got about this much amount of growth on our geometry here. So let's have a look at this in the render view and see how this is looking. And it's super small, but it's better for me. I just feel like there's a little bit of something there and it's not completely like stark and bare now. So we're going to go for that. Now this also raises another good point, is if we come back to our setup, as we're going through this now, what if we actually hit frame 150? Because we're animating through this and offsetting our frame number, if we do get to 150, it's going to clamp our instance. So it's just going to read frame 150 from then on. The trouble with this is if it just keeps reading the same frame, our animation is going to stop and your plant will look static. So we're actually going to put down a little sort of check here just to make sure that our animation hasn't reached its end frame yet. Let's put down a point wrangle. And let's just make a little visualizer here by saying if I attribute FR, so that's our frame number. So if that is greater, so it's this little arrow pointing in this direction. If it was less than, it's the other one. But we're going to say if this is greater than 149, i.e. has it become frame 150 or more, then we're just going to open brackets and let's just say attribute CD, capital C, equals, let's just make it red. So red is 1, green is 0, blue is 0, close curly brackets, and then just close out that. So now you can see as we're getting towards the end, we actually have a bit of an issue here where these ones are hitting frame 150. And so when we get to this point of our render, these flowers or these plants here are going to look like they've stopped. So we just want to adjust our values a little bit to make sure that this never actually happens. And again, as I said, if we had animated more frames, maybe if we'd animated 200 frames, we'd have a lot more essentially frames to play with here. We wouldn't have such a restriction, but we are trying to sort of keep ourselves from having to cache out too much geometry for this shot. So let's just go back to our frame and see if we can resolve this. Now the other thing that we have is we have randomized our distance here a little bit, which has given us a randomness to our overall frame number. I think I might just change this range length. Instead of 0.25, let's just bring it down slightly more to 0.2. And you can see already that's now helping a little bit more. You can see we're not getting any red ones here. Getting a little bit more at the end. Let's maybe just bring our frame offset back one more to maybe 24 frames. And now it hits red on the last frame, but because that's the last frame, that's fine. We do have a frame 150 for our Redshift proxies. So you can see now that we have essentially animation that grows up here and we're not hitting any of our limits in terms of our proxies. Now, of course, at the start here, all these are clamping to frame 0, but because the first frame of our animation is the plant completely folded up and scaled down to 0, it doesn't really matter because we're not going to see that. So let's just do one more thing. Let's have a look at our offset delay, and we can adjust essentially our offset for this. So if we bring it up, we can see that we're getting a more sort of pronounced effect of this. Maybe the ones at the end aren't going to grow on quite as much. If we bring it down to less, we can see it's a far more subtle thing. I think I'm going to go for maybe, let's try 90, see how that looks. So this is essentially what our growth is going to look like. Let's come back to our setup here, give it one more go. I'm going to save the scene file just in case. Come to our Redshift render view. Come to about frame 50. Give it a moment to load everything in. And I think this is kind of looking cool. So I'm going to render off a render of this now just to check it, and we'll come back and have a look after and see what this is like. Now, I generally just want to create a really fast render of this. So let's go to our output, come to our Redshift ROP. We're going to set this to be render frame range 1 to 125. We're going to come to our output here. I'm going to render this to our current HIP file directory, so just the normal job folder, the HIP folder, sorry, /render, and then I'm going to put HIP name /, so we're going to put the HIP name in a folder. So it's going to name it after our scene, and then I'm going to put down, paste that again. I'm not going to use $os. That will append our file name with the name of this Redshift ROP. So it's just going to be hipname.$f4.exr. And if I middle mouse click on this, you can see that is exactly the essential frame path there. Now, one more thing, if we come to our Redshift settings, while this is a nice sort of setting to see, I'm actually going to do this really quick. And a good tip you can do is if you turn on progressive rendering, and you set your passes really low to about, say, 10, maybe not that low, let's go 15. Essentially, it's going to render each frame just in progressive mode. It's going to do 15 passes and then it's going to move on. So if you want a really quick way to render a sequence, maybe while you're having a coffee or you go out for lunch, this is what I often do. And it will essentially render a really grainy and horrible version, but often it's just that you need to see the motion to see how it's looking. So I'm going to use this to render this off, and it will render a nice quick render for us. Now, one more thing I should mention here, I have had problems in the past with using optics on this. So you can see I've currently enabled optics because I've got a RT card. Now, I have had issues with crashing, and I did look it up on the Redshift forum, and from what I understand, if you're using RT at the moment, Redshift has to do all its instancing internally. It can't go out of core. And because we've got a lot of geometry going on here, it's quite easy to overload your card and crash. Now this might work. Certainly if you're using a smaller scene or smaller geometries, you'll probably be fine. In the case of something like this, I have had problems before, so I might try it without optics and see if it works. But if it does crash, and if yours does crash, I would come here and just disable optics. It will render slightly slower, and it is unfortunate, but it's kind of one of the things of using these kind of experimental features. Hopefully it will be fixed in the future. So I'm going to try it with optics on anyway. I'm going to save the scene file one last time. And then let's render this off, and we'll be back soon.